Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Brisbane, and I teach English at McMinnville High School in McMinnville, Oregon, which is just southwest of Portland a little ways. Last year, I was I had the privilege to read for the College Board AP Literature exam, and I scored the Q1 prompt, so the poetry prompt. And there are 7 things that I came up with that I wished that I would have told my students as I was sitting there grading all of these essays. So I want to give you these tips in hopes that they may help you out for this next year's exam. The first is simply you have to start out your essay with some kind of an arguable thesis. I think sometimes the prompts can be a little bit tricky, but if you think about your essay as a whole, if you don't start out with some kind of an opinion or some sort of a new insight into the text itself, you're not going to have anything to tie all of your evidence back to throughout the essay. So I want to read through the prompt from last year's poem, Plants, and I want to talk about why exactly that trips some students up in their essays. So the prompt reads, carefully read Olive Senior's 2005 poem, Plants, then in a well-organized essay, analyze how the poet portrays the complex relationships among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life. You may wish to consider the author's use of such literary techniques as syntax, diction, and figurative language. So the first advice that I would give my students is you have to answer the prompt first. And hopefully within that answer, you can give us some kind of a new insight. The tricky part is the word how in the prompt, because the word how lends itself to what literary techniques did the poet use to create that, right? And so oftentimes you would see a thesis statement that says something along the lines of Olive Senior portrayed this complex relationship between the speaker, implied audience, and plant life using the techniques of syntax, diction, and figurative language. They pulled all of that information right from the prompt. There's no new insight in there, and there's not really much of an argument there to build on. And so without that, it really weakens the overall score of the essay. So instead, rather than trying to focus on the how, focus on the what. What is that complex relationship like? What do you know about the speaker? What do you know about their implied audience? What is the speaker telling us about the plants themselves? And then characterize your interpretation of those relationships between those 3 figures. If you can do that, and then the upper half essays, upper third essays, the 7s, 8s, and 9s, not only identified that relationship, but then they took it and connected it to a theme as well. So if you can do those 2 things in your thesis statement, it's going to set your essay up for a much higher score to be more successful. The second thing that I wish I would have told my students is to make sure to organize by either insight or organize chronologically, work their way through the poem from beginning to end. Most essays that I read organized by literary device. And again, this goes back to the prompt itself. It gives you that 3-pronged sort of like tailor-made 5-paragraph essay. We're going to write a paragraph about syntax, a paragraph about diction, a paragraph about figurative language. And the problem with that is it really pigeonholes the analysis for that paragraph. Now you can write a paragraph, but it's only focused on syntax. And so you can't bring in other pieces of evidence. Whereas if you're writing about, or if you're organizing by insight, or if you're organizing chronologically, you can pull in all of the different literary techniques that the poet is using in that specific piece or that specific example. And it gives you much more flexibility as a writer to get to some of those deeper insights. Another thing to think about is how you're using quotes. Try not to quote 2 and 3 lines of the text at a time. Try to just pick and choose 1 or 2, maybe 3-word phrases to kind of embed and blend in with your analysis as you're writing your essay. If you can blend those quotes together, that really scores high on the apt and specific textual reference piece of the scoring guide. There's a great example of this in the sample essays that were released by the College Board last year. On the 8 example, I believe it's sample AA. So if you take a look at like the second and the third body paragraphs, or the second and third paragraphs overall of that essay, you'll see exactly how a student can kind of blend those together skillfully. Another piece of advice that I would give you is be careful when you are using literary devices in your analysis. Yes, you do need to identify some of them, but it doesn't stop with just identification. You have to be able to tie them into the meaning. You have to be able to talk about their function. How do they help you to understand this relationship between the speaker and the plants and the implied audience? And if you don't make that connection, then it doesn't really count as much of an analysis. So for example, there were several essays that I read last year that talked about how the poem is organized into quatrains. And yes, that's true. The poem does have a series of quatrains there, but how does that affect the meaning? If you can tie that into meaning, that's fantastic. That's great analysis. But if you don't tie it back into how that functions within the poem and how you can gain some insight into what the poem is trying to say, then you're better off trying to focus on something else. I want to talk specifically about how to use diction in your analysis as well. Try to avoid at all costs the sentence, "The author uses diction to portray this relationship." In other words, you're just saying the author uses words to portray this relationship. So try to give a specific adjective right in front of the word diction, and that will really help out your analysis as well. For example, in this particular poem, you might say that the speaker is sort of condescending, right? Because they use words like "don't deny it" or "believe me," innocent, as they're addressing their implied audience. And so rather than saying the author uses diction, you might say the author uses condescending diction or patronizing diction. And that's a much better approach to analysis than just saying diction alone. And then finally, the last piece is every poem that you read is going to have some kind of a tone. In other words, what is the author or the speaker's attitude about the topic that they're focusing on? And at some point in most poems, the tone is going to shift. And so if you can focus on the before and the after and the reason for the shift, then now you're getting into some really sophisticated analysis. And so really try to key in, no matter what poem you come across, really try to key in on the tone and how that functions within the text as well. So those are my 7 tips. Thanks for watching, and good luck on your tests this year.